On September 14, 1990, $7.1 million disappeared from the Nebraska Agricultural Investment Trust in Lincoln, Nebraska. The money represented the life savings of over 300 farming families across the Midwest who had pooled their resources during one of the most devastating agricultural crises in American history. For 25 years, investigators pursued dead ends and false leads, while the mastermind behind the scheme lived quietly among the very community he had betrayed. The resolution, when it finally came in 2015, arrived not through brilliant detective work or advanced forensics, but through an act of Christian charity that would expose one of the most patient and calculated frauds in Nebraska history. The man responsible was Demetrius Lamont Hayes, a 42-year-old financial advisor who had built his reputation on trust, community service, and an intimate understanding of rural America's economic struggles. Hayes didn't vanish into the night after the theft. He didn't flee to a foreign country or assume a false identity. Instead, he remained in Nebraska, attending church every Sunday, volunteering at food banks, and maintaining the same modest lifestyle that had made him so trusted in the first place. His ability to hide in plain sight, to carry the weight of 300 families' shattered dreams while presenting a face of humble service, represented a masterclass in psychological endurance that would baffle investigators for a quarter century. The discovery of his crime would come not from law enforcement, but from the accounting department of the First Baptist Church of Omaha, where a routine review of a substantial, anonymous donation would set in motion a chain of events that finally brought justice to the victims who had long since given up. Hope. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Demetrius Hayes pulled off one of Nebraska's most devastating financial crimes, you have to understand the desperation that gripped America's heartland in the late 1980s. The farm crisis that began in the early part of that decade had decimated rural communities across the Midwest. Land values had collapsed, commodity prices had plummeted, and thousands of family farms that had operated for generations were facing foreclosure. In Nebraska alone, more than 2,000 farms went under between 1984 and 1989. The psychological toll was immeasurable. Suicide rates among farmers skyrocketed. Marriages dissolved under financial pressure. Small towns watched their main streets empty out as businesses closed one after another. Into this landscape of desperation walked Demetrius Hayes, a Lincoln native who had grown up in a farming family himself before earning a degree in agricultural economics from the University of Nebraska. Hayes understood the farming community because he came from it. His grandfather had lost the family farm in Gage County during the Great Depression, a story Hayes often shared with clients. He spoke their language, understood their fears, and most importantly, he presented himself as one of them, someone who had escaped the farm but never forgotten his roots. Hayes worked for Cornhusker Financial Services, a small investment firm on O Street in downtown Lincoln that specialized in agricultural accounts. By 1987, he had built a solid reputation among farming families in Lancaster, Gage, Seward, and Jefferson counties. He drove a modest Ford pickup truck. He wore off-the-rack suits. He attended client barbecues and county fairs. He was known for making house calls, sitting at kitchen tables with farmers and their wives, explaining investment strategies in plain language while drinking coffee from chipped mugs. The idea for the Nebraska Agricultural Investment Trust came to Hayes gradually, emerging from hundreds of conversations with desperate clients who were watching their life's work slip away. Many of these farmers had equity locked up in land they couldn't sell, equipment they couldn't afford to maintain, and crops they couldn't profit from. What they needed was liquidity, a way to access capital that could help them weather the crisis until commodity prices recovered. Hayes spent 18 months developing the concept. He consulted with attorneys, studied similar investment vehicles in other states, and built financial models that projected impressive returns. The trust would pool investments from multiple farming families, allowing them to maintain their land while accessing the capital they desperately needed. The money would be invested in a diversified portfolio of agricultural commodities, farm equipment manufacturers, and food processing companies. Investors would receive quarterly dividends and maintain the option to withdraw their principal with 90 days' notice. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, It was designed to fail from the very beginning. Hayes launched the Nebraska Agricultural Investment Trust in January 1989, working with a lawyer named Vernon Blackwell to file the appropriate paperwork with the state. The trust was established as a limited partnership with Hayes serving as the general partner and investment manager. His fee structure appeared modest, just 1.5% of assets under management annually, significantly lower than most investment funds charged at the time. The first investors were farmers Hayes had known for years, people who trusted him implicitly. The Johnsons from Beatrice put in $47,000. The Williams family from Crete invested $62,000. The Hendersons from Wilbur contributed $83,000, representing everything they had left after selling off equipment to pay down their operating loans. Word spread through church congregations, grain elevator parking lots, and coffee shops in small towns across southeastern Nebraska. Hayes was meticulous in his cultivation of trust. He provided detailed monthly statements showing steady growth. He paid quarterly dividends like clockwork, always on time, always accompanied by a personalized letter, explaining market conditions and future outlook. When investors had questions, he made himself available day or night. When they needed advice on other financial matters, he provided it free of charge. What none of them knew was that Hayes had been carefully studying the trust's structure for vulnerabilities from the moment he created it. He had deliberately designed the investment vehicle with minimal outside oversight. Vernon Blackwell, the attorney who had helped establish the trust, had retired to Arizona in July 1989, leaving Hayes without meaningful legal supervision. The trust's accountant was a sole practitioner in Seward named Gerald Moss, who handled dozens of small business clients and relied heavily on documentation provided by Hayes himself. Hayes had also ensured that the trust's custodial bank account was established at Great Plains Bank in Lincoln, a small community bank where he had a personal relationship with the branch manager, a man named Robert Chen, who had grown up in Lincoln's small black community and viewed Hayes as a success story worth supporting. Chen processed the trust's transactions without the kind of scrutiny a larger institution might have applied. By September 1990, the Nebraska Agricultural Investment Trust held $7.1 million in assets representing the pooled investments of 317 farming families. Hayes had spent 19 months building credibility, establishing patterns, and creating the infrastructure for what would come next. The technical challenge wasn't accessing the money. As the general partner and investment manager, Hayes had full authority over the trust's accounts. The challenge was creating a plausible explanation for the money's disappearance that would buy him enough time to vanish before anyone realized what had happened. Hayes spent the spring and summer of 1990 carefully constructing the narrative. He began speaking with investors about a unique opportunity he had discovered, a chance to invest in a portfolio of distressed farm properties that could be purchased at significant discounts and held until the market recovered. The investment would be lucrative, but would require moving the trust's capital into a special escrow account while the transactions were structured and negotiated. In reality, Hayes had been methodically creating a second identity, not a new name or a false passport, but rather a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts designed to receive and obscure the trust's assets. He had established 3 separate business entities in Delaware over the preceding 6 months: Heartland Agricultural Holdings LLC, Midwest Farm Properties Inc., and Prairie Capital Management Corporation. Each had its own federal tax identification number. Each had a registered agent in Wilmington. Each had a business address at a mail forwarding service that Hayes paid for with money orders purchased at different post offices around Lincoln. Through these entities, Hayes opened accounts at 4 different banks, 2 in Denver, 1 in Kansas City, and 1 in Sioux Falls. He never conducted business in person, handling everything through mail and telephone conversations. The amounts he initially deposited were small, just enough to establish the accounts and create a transaction history that appeared legitimate. The offshore component was more complex. Hayes had traveled to the Cayman Islands twice in 1989, ostensibly for continuing education conferences related to agricultural finance. In reality, he had spent those trips establishing relationships with 2 banks in Georgetown that specialized in privacy-focused accounts for international clients. He used the Delaware shell companies as the account holders, creating an additional layer of separation between himself and the ultimate destination of the funds. September 14th, 1990, was a Friday. Hayes had chosen the date carefully. The weekend would provide a buffer before anyone noticed irregularities, and the following Monday was the beginning of harvest season for many of the trust's investors, meaning they would be consumed with their crops rather than monitoring their investment accounts. Hayes arrived at his office at Cornhusker Financial Services at 7:15 that morning, his usual time. He exchanged pleasantries with the receptionist, a woman named Dorothy Kincaid, who had worked at the firm for 12 years. He stopped at the break room for coffee. He reviewed his appointment calendar with the same attention to routine that had characterized his entire professional life. At 9:30, he drove to Great Plains Bank. Robert Chen wasn't there that morning, which Hayes had verified through a casual phone call the previous day. The assistant manager, a young woman named Jennifer Sullivan, processed Hayes's wire transfer request without hesitation. Hayes had processed dozens of wire transfers over the preceding months as part of the trust's normal operations. This request, transferring the trust's entire balance of $7,143,017 to Heartland Agricultural Holdings account in Denver, appeared no different on the surface. The wire was initiated at 9:52. Hayes returned to his office at 10:20. He spent the rest of the day conducting business as usual, meeting with 3 different clients about retirement planning and crop insurance. He left the office at 5:30, stopped at the grocery store, and went home to his apartment on South 27th Street, a modest 2-bedroom unit he had rented for the past 4 years. Over the weekend, Hayes executed the second phase of the plan. Using telephone banking services, he transferred the funds from the Denver account to the Kansas City account, then from Kansas City to Sioux Falls, then from Sioux Falls back to the second Denver account. Each transfer was structured to appear as a legitimate business transaction between the shell companies, payment for consulting services or property management fees. The documentation Hayes had prepared supported the fiction that these were routine business expenses. On Monday morning, September 17th, Hayes initiated the final domestic transfer, moving the money from Denver to a brokerage account he had opened at Schwab under the name Prairie Capital Management Corporation. From there, acting as an authorized agent of Prairie Capital, he purchased $7 million worth of bearer bonds, an increasingly rare financial instrument that functioned essentially as cash. The bonds were held in certificate form at the brokerage firm. That same afternoon, Hayes called in sick to work, claiming a severe flu. Over the next 3 days, while supposedly recovering at home, he executed the most critical phase of the operation. Using a false identification he had carefully constructed over the preceding year, a driver's license and passport in the name of Marcus Denton, Hayes traveled to New York City. The documents weren't sophisticated forgeries, but they didn't need to be. They simply needed to establish a paper trail that led nowhere. In New York, Marcus Denton visited Schwab's office on Madison Avenue and requested physical delivery of the bearer bonds held in Prairie Capital Management's account. The firm required 3 forms of identification and significant documentation, all of which Hayes had meticulously prepared. By September 20th, he walked out of the building carrying $7 million in negotiable instruments inside a leather briefcase he had purchased specifically for this purpose. From New York, Hayes flew to Miami under his real identity. The bearer bonds remained in a safe deposit box he had rented at a bank in Queens under the Marcus Denton identity. Over the next 2 weeks, making multiple trips between Lincoln and New York, Hayes gradually transported the bonds to Miami, where he converted them through a series of transactions, with currency exchanges and private brokers into a mixture of cash and wire transfers to the Cayman Islands accounts. The beauty of bearer bonds was their anonymity. They could be redeemed by whoever possessed them, no questions asked. They were the financial equivalent of paper currency, and in 1990, they were still readily accepted by institutions willing to overlook the obvious implications of someone presenting millions of dollars worth of them. By October 15, 1990, the money was gone. $7.1 million had been moved through multiple jurisdictions, converted from electronic transfers to physical instruments and back to electronic form, and ultimately deposited in accounts in the Cayman Islands that existed in the names of Delaware corporations, that led back to a registered agent who knew nothing about the beneficial owner of those entities. The discovery of the theft came gradually, then all at once. The first indication something was wrong came when Gerald Moss, the trust's accountant, attempted to reconcile the September statements and noticed the massive outgoing wire transfer. Moss called Hayes immediately, reaching him at home on October 16th. Hayes explained calmly that the transfer represented the down payment on the distressed farm property portfolio he had been discussing with investors. The money was in escrow, everything was proceeding according to plan, and detailed documentation would be available within 2 weeks once the legal paperwork was finalized. Moss was satisfied with the explanation. Hayes had never given him reason to doubt before, but 3 days later, one of the trust's larger investors, a farmer named Robert Williams from Crete, called Moss directly with questions about accessing his principal. Williams was facing an unexpected tax bill and needed to withdraw $60,000. Moss explained that the money was currently tied up in the escrow account for the farm property investment. Williams was confused. He had never authorized such an investment and had never heard Hayes mention any such opportunity. Moss called Hayes again. This time, Hayes's explanation was more elaborate, involving complex financial structures and regulatory requirements that made the investment difficult to explain to lay investors. He promised to schedule a meeting with Williams and other concerned investors to explain everything in detail. The meeting never happened. On October 21st, Gerald Moss drove to Hayes's apartment and found it empty. Hayes hadn't shown up at Cornhusker Financial Services for 3 days, claiming continued illness. When Dorothy Kincaid called his home number, she got a disconnected message. Moss went to Great Plains Bank and demanded to see the trust's account records. What he discovered made his hands shake as he turned the pages. The $7 million transfer to Heartland Agricultural Holdings, a Denver bank he had never heard of, an account in the name of a company that existed nowhere in the trust's documentation. On October 22nd, Moss filed a report with the Lincoln Police Department. By October 24th, the FBI was involved, and by October 26th, 317 farming families across southeastern Nebraska were learning that their last hope for financial survival had disappeared. The investigation was immediate and comprehensive. FBI Special Agent Sandra Martinez took lead on the case, coordinating with agents from the Denver and Miami field offices. What they discovered was a trail that seemed to lead everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The shell companies in Delaware existed but had no assets. The bank accounts in Denver, Kansas City, and Sioux Falls had been closed. The funds moved on before investigators could freeze them. The brokerage account at Schwab in New York showed the purchase and subsequent delivery of bearer bonds that could now be anywhere in the world. The Marcus Denton identity proved to be a dead end. The passport and driver's license were sophisticated enough to fool casual inspection, but couldn't withstand serious scrutiny. The name appeared nowhere in Social Security records or credit databases. It was a ghost, used once and discarded. Investigators interviewed everyone who knew Hayes. His colleagues at Cornhusker Financial Services described him as diligent, honest, almost boring in his routine. His landlord said he had been a model tenant who paid rent on time and never complained. His clients, the very people he had defrauded, struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the crime he had committed. The most puzzling aspect was Hayes's apparent lack of obvious vices or warning signs. He didn't gamble. He didn't use drugs. He had no expensive habits or secret lifestyle. His apartment, when investigators finally gained access, was modestly furnished with second-hand furniture and limited personal effects. His bank accounts showed a middle-class lifestyle with no unusual expenditures. He drove a 6-year-old truck. He wore inexpensive clothes. Where was the motivation? Where were the warning signs? What investigators didn't know was that Demetrius Hayes hadn't left Nebraska at all. He had, in fact, driven back from his final trip to Miami, arriving in Omaha on October 18th, 3 days before Gerald Moss discovered the theft. While the FBI was building their case in Lincoln, Hayes was settling into a furnished apartment in northwest Omaha under a lease signed with his own name, using identification that was entirely legitimate. This was the most audacious part of Hayes's plan, the element that separated his crime from typical fraud cases. He wasn't running, he was hiding in the open, betting that investigators would assume he had fled the country, that the sophisticated offshore structure and the fake identity meant he was living on a beach in the Caribbean or a villa in Europe. The psychology behind this decision was complex. Hayes had studied enough cases to know that fugitives who ran internationally eventually got caught. Extradition treaties had become more comprehensive. Financial surveillance had become more sophisticated. The world was getting smaller, and staying ahead of determined investigators required constant vigilance. Constant movement, a life of permanent paranoia, but staying in Nebraska, living quietly under his own name in a city just 50 miles from the scene of the crime, required a different kind of endurance. It required absolute discipline, perfect consistency, and the psychological fortitude to carry the weight of 300 destroyed families while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Hayes found work within 2 weeks of settling in Omaha. Not in finance, not in anything related to his previous career, but as a night shift supervisor at a commercial printing facility called Midwest Graphics on Leavenworth Street. He applied using his real Social Security number and a resume that honestly listed his education and work history up until 1989. When the HR manager asked about the gap in his employment, Hayes explained that he had spent the past year caring for his dying mother in Lincoln, a fiction that was impossible to verify but entirely plausible. The job paid $32,000 annually, barely a third of what he had earned at Cornhusker Financial Services. He worked 4 nights a week, Tuesday through Friday, overseeing a crew of 12 people who operated printing presses and binding equipment for corporate clients. He was punctual, professional, and unremarkable. His co-workers described him as friendly but private, someone who did his job well but didn't socialize much outside of work. Hayes's financial strategy during these years demonstrated remarkable restraint. The $7 million remained in the Cayman Islands, earning modest interest in accounts that required no activity, no withdrawals, nothing that might generate paperwork or trigger reporting requirements. Hayes lived entirely on his salary from Midwest Graphics, maintaining a lifestyle that matched his income precisely. He rented a 1-bedroom apartment in a middle-income complex near 72nd and Dodge. He drove a used Honda Civic he purchased for $4,000, cash from a private seller. He shopped at discount grocery stores and bought clothes at Target. His only indulgences were books, which he purchased at used bookstores, and church attendance at First Baptist Church of Omaha, a large congregation where he could remain anonymous in the crowd. The church became central to Hayes's life during these years, though whether this represented genuine faith or calculated image management remained unclear even to Hayes himself. He attended every Sunday, sitting in the back rows, participating in the singing, but never drawing attention. He volunteered for the food bank on Wednesday evenings, stacking cans and sorting donations alongside retired teachers and college students. He joined a men's Bible study group that met Tuesday mornings before he went home to sleep before his night shift. The psychological toll of maintaining this double life was something Hayes had underestimated. The first year was the hardest. Every time a police car appeared in his rearview mirror, his hands would grip the steering wheel tighter. Every time someone from his past life appeared in Omaha, which happened rarely but occasionally, he would take elaborate precautions to avoid them. Every time he heard news reports about the ongoing investigation, which continued with decreasing frequency, he felt his stomach clench. But as the years passed and no arrest came, Hayes began to relax incrementally. The FBI eventually shifted resources to other cases. The story of the Nebraska Agricultural Investment Trust faded from newspapers. The families he had defrauded pursued civil litigation against everyone connected to the case, recovering pennies on the dollar from insurance policies and the liquidation of Cornhusker Financial Services. But Hayes himself had disappeared from their ability to reach him. By 1995, 5 years after the crime, Hayes had established a routine so consistent that it felt almost genuine. The man who had stolen $7 million from desperate farming families had become a night shift supervisor at a printing plant who volunteered at church and lived paycheck to paycheck. The cognitive dissonance was profound, but Hayes managed it through compartmentalization so complete that sometimes he could go weeks without consciously thinking about the money sitting in the Cayman Islands. He dated occasionally, women he met through church or work, but never seriously. Any real relationship would require explanations for his past that he couldn't provide. He made friends but kept them at a distance. He developed hobbies, reading primarily, that required no social interaction. He created a life that was fundamentally incomplete, and he lived it with meticulous consistency. There were close calls over the years. In 1998, an FBI agent named Thomas Reeves reopened the Hayes case as part of a broader investigation into offshore financial fraud. Reeves developed a theory that Hayes might have remained in the United States, possibly even in Nebraska, and spent 6 months conducting a review of employment records, tax filings, and public databases. The search came within inches of Hayes when Reeves requested employment records from companies in Omaha that might have hired someone with Hayes's background. But Midwest Graphics wasn't on that list. The printing industry didn't match Hayes's professional profile, and the algorithmic searchers Reeves employed were looking for financial services companies, agricultural businesses, and related industries. Hayes' decision to completely change careers, to move into an unrelated field where his skills were vastly underutilized, proved to be brilliant protection. In 2003, Hayes' father died in Los Angeles, where he had moved decades earlier. Hayes didn't attend the funeral, couldn't risk the travel or the possibility of encountering relatives who might still be in contact with people from his past. The loss affected him more than he expected, adding another layer of isolation to a life already defined by it. By 2010, 20 years after the crime, Hayes had settled into middle age. He was 52 years old, still working at Midwest Graphics, though now in a slightly higher position as operations manager. He had moved to a nicer apartment, though still modest by any standard. His hair had gone grey. He had developed a slight paunch from years of night shift work and limited exercise. He looked like exactly what he appeared to be, a quiet, middle-aged man who worked hard, attended church, and lived simply. The money in the Cayman Islands had grown through conservative investments to approximately $11 million. Hayes checked the balances twice a year through secure online access, but otherwise never touched the accounts, never withdrew a penny, never did anything that might generate attention. The discipline was extraordinary, the patience superhuman. What Hayes didn't anticipate was that his downfall would come not from sophisticated investigation or financial forensics, but from an impulse he couldn't quite identify even to himself. A moment of weakness that might have been guilt, or might have been simply the desire to do something meaningful with money that had been hidden away for a quarter century. In January 2015, Hayes made a decision that would unravel everything he had built. He decided to make an anonymous donation to First Baptist Church of Omaha, the congregation where he had worshipped quietly for 24 years. The church was conducting a capital campaign to build a new youth center, a facility that would serve at-risk teenagers in North Omaha with tutoring, sports programs, and mentorship opportunities. Hayes had watched the campaign progress over the previous year, had seen the thermometer display in the church lobby tracking donations toward the $2 million goal. He decided to donate $50,000 anonymously. In his mind, the amount was insignificant compared to the total he had hidden away. It would help the church reach its goal. It would do some good in the world, and it was small enough that it wouldn't attract attention. Hayes was wrong on that last count. To make the donation, Hayes couldn't simply wire money from the Cayman Islands accounts. That would create a direct connection between his name and offshore accounts that would immediately trigger suspicion. Instead, he developed a plan to slowly liquidate small portions of the investments, convert them to cash through currency exchanges during trips to Kansas City and Chicago, and then make the donation through a cashier's check purchased with cash. The process took 3 months. Hayes made 5 separate trips to different cities, each time converting $10,000 from offshore investments into cash, then into money orders or cashier's checks. The transactions were structured to stay below the $10,000 reporting threshold that would trigger currency transaction reports. On April 3, 2015, Hayes presented the First Baptist Church of Omaha with a cashier's check for $50,000. The check was made out from a bank in Chicago, purchased with cash, and accompanied by a letter requesting the donation remain anonymous. The church's development director, a woman named Patricia Monroe, was thrilled. She thanked the anonymous donor through a letter placed in the church bulletin and added the donation to the capital campaign total. The church's policy for large donations required them to be reviewed by both the accounting department and an independent auditor to ensure proper documentation for tax purposes, even if the donor wished to remain anonymous. This was standard practice for any religious organization, a safeguard against money laundering and a requirement for maintaining their tax-exempt status. The accounting review was conducted by Sandra Phillips, a meticulous woman who had worked in the church's financial office for 11 years. Phillips noticed several irregularities about the donation. The cashier's check came from a bank in Chicago, but there was no indication of why someone from Chicago would make such a substantial donation to a church in Omaha. The timing was unusual. Arriving near the end of the capital campaign, rather than at the beginning when most large donations typically came in. And most puzzling, the church had no record of any contact from a potential donor in Chicago, no inquiries about the campaign, no correspondence that would explain the gift. Phillips did what she was trained to do. She contacted the issuing bank in Chicago to verify the cashier's check was legitimate. The bank confirmed the check was valid and had been purchased with cash on March 27th. When Phillips asked if they could provide any information about who purchased it, the bank explained their privacy policies prevented them from disclosing that information without a legal request. Phillips might have stopped there, but something about the situation bothered her. She had handled hundreds of donations over the years and had developed an instinct for transactions that didn't feel right. She contacted the church's legal counsel, an attorney named Michael Bradford who volunteered his services, and explained her concerns. Bradford advised that the church should report the suspicious donation to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, a division of the Treasury Department that tracks potential money laundering through religious and charitable organizations. On April 17th, Phillips filed a suspicious activity report detailing the circumstances of the donation. The report sat in a database for 3 weeks before an analyst named Jessica Martinez flagged it for further review. Martinez's job was to identify patterns in suspicious activity reports that might indicate broader financial crimes. The $50,000 donation to a church in Omaha might have been nothing, but Martinez ran it through FinCEN's database to see if there were any connections to other reports. What she found was interesting. Over the preceding 3 months, there had been 15 separate currency exchanges in Kansas City and Chicago involving amounts between $9,000 and $10,000, all conducted by the same individual based on the description provided by the currency exchange businesses. The businesses had filed the reports not because they were legally required to, but because the pattern of transactions seemed designed to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements. Martinez contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Omaha and shared her findings. On May 12th, Special Agent David Richardson began reviewing the case. Richardson had been with the FBI for 19 years and had worked dozens of money laundering investigations. The pattern Martinez had identified was classic structuring behavior, the deliberate breaking up of large transactions into smaller amounts to avoid detection. Richardson obtained subpoenas for the security camera footage from the currency exchanges in Kansas City and Chicago. The footage showed a black man in his mid to late 50s, average height, grey hair, glasses, wearing casual clothing. The man had conducted the transactions calmly, professionally, with no apparent nervousness. The currency exchange operators who were interviewed remembered him vaguely as polite and efficient. Richardson then obtained a subpoena for the bank records from the Chicago institution that issued the cashier's check. The bank provided transaction details showing the check had been purchased by a man matching the same description, paying with cash that had been collected from the multiple money orders he had been accumulating. The break came when Richardson decided to cross-reference the physical description with unsolved financial crimes in the region. It was a long shot, but Richardson was thorough. He ran searches through FBI databases looking for cases involving missing money, fraud, embezzlement, anything that might connect to a middle-aged black man with ties to Nebraska. The Nebraska Agricultural Investment Trust case appeared in the results. Richardson pulled the file, which had been officially suspended in 2003 after 12 years of failed investigation. He looked at the case photos of Demetrius Hayes, aged by 25 years in his mind, and compared them to the security camera images from the currency exchanges. The resemblance was striking, but not definitive. 25 years changed a person. Hayes had been 42 in the original photos, heavy and clean-shaven. The man in the security footage was older, thinner, wearing glasses Hayes had never worn before. But the bone structure was similar. The way he moved was similar. Richardson had seen enough aged progressions to recognize the possibility. On May 28th, Richardson obtained authorization to conduct surveillance on First Baptist Church of Omaha. If Hayes had made the donation and lived locally, there was a chance he attended services there. It was speculative, but Richardson's instinct told him the donation wasn't random. Something connected the donor to that specific church. For 3 Sundays, agents photographed attendees at First Baptist Church services. They captured hundreds of faces, running them through facial recognition databases and comparing them manually to the Hayes case photos. On June 21, 2015, a surveillance photo captured a man entering the church who bore a strong resemblance to the security footage from the currency exchanges. The same glasses, the same grey hair, the same general build and demeanour. Richardson ran the photograph through enhanced facial recognition software that could account for aging. The system returned a probability match of 84% that the man in the photograph was Demetrius Lamont Hayes. On June 22nd, agents followed the man from First Baptist Church to an apartment complex near 72nd and Dodge. They waited until he left for work, then ran his license plate. The vehicle was registered to Demetrius Hayes at that address. 25 years after stealing $7.1 million from 317 farming families, Hayes was working the night shift at a printing plant in Omaha, living under his own name, just 50 miles from the scene of his crime. The FBI arrested Demetrius Hayes on June 24, 2015 at his apartment. Agents arrived at 6 in the morning, just as Hayes was returning home from his night shift. He didn't resist. He didn't express surprise. He simply asked if he could change out of his work clothes before being taken into custody. In his apartment, investigators found no evidence of wealth, no expensive possessions, no hidden cash, nothing that indicated Hayes had access to millions of dollars. What they did find was extensive documentation related to the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, carefully maintained in a fireproof safe in his bedroom closet. Hayes had kept records of everything, every transaction, every investment decision, meticulously organized as if he were maintaining the accounts for legitimate clients. Under interrogation, Hayes was cooperative but unemotional. He admitted to the theft, explained his methodology in detail, and provided access to all the offshore accounts without requiring additional legal pressure. When asked why he had made the donation to the church, he struggled to articulate an answer. He mentioned wanting to do something good, wanting the money to serve some purpose beyond sitting in accounts earning interest. He acknowledged it was foolish from a criminal perspective, but he seemed unable to fully explain the impulse even to himself. The Cayman Islands accounts held $11.2 million. Federal prosecutors seized all of it, along with Hayes's modest savings and personal property. After legal fees and restitution distribution costs, approximately $9.4 million was returned to the victims of the original fraud. Given that they had lost $7.1 million in 1990 dollars, the recovered amount represented substantial but incomplete compensation when adjusted for inflation and opportunity cost. Hayes pled guilty to wire fraud, money laundering, and multiple related charges in October 2015. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, a relatively lenient sentence given the magnitude of his crimes, attributed to his cooperation and the fact that he had ultimately led investigators to recovering most of the stolen funds. He was also ordered to pay restitution for the remaining shortfall, though his ability to satisfy that obligation was obviously non-existent. The victims' responses were complex. Some expressed satisfaction at seeing Hayes finally face justice. Others felt the recovered money came too late, noting that many of the families who had been defrauded had lost their farms anyway in the years after 1990, their lives permanently altered by Hayes's actions. Several of the original investors had died in the intervening years, never knowing the money would eventually be recovered. The psychological profile that emerged from the case fascinated criminologists and behavioral analysts. Hayes had demonstrated extraordinary patience and discipline, living for 25 years with access to millions while maintaining a middle-class lifestyle. He had avoided the typical pitfalls that caught most financial criminals: the temptation to spend, the inability to resist small indulgences that eventually created patterns investigators could follow. What undid him wasn't greed or carelessness, but something that might have been conscience, or might have been simply the human need to find meaning in circumstances that had none. The irony that an act of charity exposed a quarter-century of successful hiding wasn't lost on anyone involved in the case. The Nebraska agricultural investment trust fraud led to significant changes in how agricultural investment vehicles were regulated in Nebraska and neighboring states. The state legislature passed new laws requiring enhanced oversight for pooled investment funds targeting farming communities, mandatory independent audits, and stronger fiduciary requirements for fund managers. These reforms came far too late for Hayes's victims, but they provided some assurance that similar frauds would be more difficult to execute in the future. First Baptist Church of Omaha returned the $50,000 donation to the restitution fund, despite having already allocated it toward the youth center construction. The church's congregation took up a special offering to replace those funds, ultimately raising more than $70,000, as if trying to cleanse the institution of any connection to Hayes's crime. Hayes is currently serving his sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Terre Haute, Indiana. He will be eligible for release in 2028, when he will be 70 years old. In prison interviews, he has expressed remorse for the harm he caused, though victims and investigators remain divided on whether that remorse is genuine or simply another performance from a man who spent a quarter century performing a role. The case of Demetrius Hayes remains one of the most unusual in the annals of American financial crime, a testament to human patience, discipline, and the complex psychology of guilt. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous criminals aren't those who flee to distant countries or live lives of obvious excess, but those who hide in plain sight, sitting in church pews and working night shifts, carrying the weight of their crimes with such composure that they become invisible even to themselves. The farming families of southeastern Nebraska, those who survived the crisis and those who didn't, became an unlikely community bound by shared loss and eventual partial recovery. Several formed a victims' advocacy group that lobbied for the regulatory reforms that followed, transforming their trauma into policy change that protected future investors. Gerald Moss, the accountant who first discovered the theft, retired in 2005 but remained haunted by the case. He testified at Hayes's sentencing, describing how the fraud had destroyed not just financial security, but the fundamental trust that held rural communities together. The breach of faith, he argued, was more devastating than the monetary loss. Sandra Martinez, the FBI agent who led the original investigation, had retired by the time Hayes was arrested, but she attended the trial. She described feeling both vindicated and frustrated, satisfied that justice had finally come, but troubled by how close Hayes had come to succeeding indefinitely. Had he not made that donation, had he maintained his discipline just a few years longer, he might have simply died of natural causes with his secret intact. The youth center at First Baptist Church was completed in 2016, dedicated to the families who lost everything in 1990. A small plaque in the lobby tells their story without mentioning Hayes by name, a memorial to resilience rather than crime. For the people of Nebraska's farming communities, the Hayes case became a cautionary tale told at kitchen tables and church gatherings, a reminder that trust, once broken, leaves scars that no amount of recovered money can fully heal. The $7.1 million that vanished in 1990 destroyed lives not just through its absence, but through the betrayal it represented, a wound that remained even after the money, 25 years later, finally came home.